Good afternoon. I'm glad you can find some time to devote to worship on this weekend. I don't have any announcements, so this is the second Sunday of the season of Easter, and we'll just dive right in. Three of the most important books I've ever read would have to be the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Yes, the Bible is the most important, and we'll get to the Bible in a minute. We're going to get there. We're going to take the long route to get there today. We have a few other books to look at first. The Lord of the Rings is a set of books, fictional books. They're set in a fantasy world that tell the story of Frodo, he is the person who carries the One Ring. One ring to rule them, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, is what the story of that ring, how it sort of begins. Frodo did not ask for this task to carry this ring that carries with it the risk of just such utter destruction. If the wrong person gets this ring, it could be horrible for all of Middle-earth, the world that he lives in. And he is not of a type of a person who just is set to go off and adventure on the drop of a hat. He's a hobbit, and hobbits like to have first breakfast, second breakfast, lunch, tea. Like they like to sort of, they're not up for a fast-paced life. But he takes takes on this task, and it's an impressive decision he makes. And so what happens is a group of people, the Fellowship of the Ring, gather around him, and every one of these people is just amazingly interesting and fascinating, and Gimli and Legolas, a dwarf and an elf who get over their long-standing suspicion of the other type of person and find this friendship. Aragorn, who grapples with the failures in his family, and there are failures in his family, and believes in himself, trusting what other people see in him when he doesn't see it himself, right? Gandalf, who gathers the group together and trusts people. He just trusts people to follow through. Merry and Pippin, two other hobbits who they grow up over the course of these three books. They literally they grow up and learn to grapple with the world around them. Boromir, who means well, but he falls to the temptation to use that the ends justifies the means, and you just do whatever it takes, and how that tragedy unfolds. And then Sam is the good friend. Sam is the one that Frodo leans on every step of the way, and he is the humble servant who in many ways is the hero of the whole story. None of them are perfect, but to read this trilogy of the Lord of the Rings was how I met these characters. They're fictional, yes, but they're real because they're fleshed out and they're important, and they show virtues. They show what it's worth living for, and it's a beautiful story, and it's just an amazing read. It's an amazing world to get wrapped up in. And if you haven't read the books, I hope you've been able to watch the movies, the director's cut, of course, because it is so much better. My one beef with the movies is that they get a character wrong. They get a virtue wrong. Like the Ents, these living trees. In the books, they choose to get into the conflict to guard the world because they make a decision that it is the right thing to do. And it's a very reasoned out thing. And it's showing the nature of when do you wade in, even when it doesn't have to be your fight, but you can go in and make a difference. And in the movies, they get tricked into this conflict, and that's always bothered me because it's distorting one aspect of the goodness of these characters. And so, as you might have guessed, I read a lot growing up. I read a lot of books. It wasn't just the Lord of the Rings and these characters I'm just giving you the briefest description of. It was R.A. Salvatore, and he wrote these books about a dark elf who chooses to go find a new world and leaving behind, and the courage to do that. It's the stories of Donaldson, who writes the Thomas Covenant series. Thomas is a leper who's stuck in a world that he doesn't know if he believes in, and how does he choose to do good? How does he discern what is the right thing to do when so much is not certain and so much is not known? The stories of written by C.S. Forester, the Horatio Hornblower series, written of the British Navy during the Napoleonic War, and how this young officer grapples with his own insecurities. And to the rest of the world, he looks like he knows what he's doing, but you're reading the book, so you hear the inner monologue, and you hear how he struggles with himself to figure out what to do. And Frank Herbert, Terry Brooks, C.S. Friedman, these are the authors who created worlds that pulled me in and showed me amazing stories, good stories, profound stories that help shape like what I understand to be good and important today. Right? So a few years ago, I thought, I'd like to have a new book to read. And so I looked up who are like the next set of authors, who are the next batch of people who are sort of stepping in to carry on writing this great fiction and great fantasy. And I saw one of the most well-reviewed books of that year was a book called The Magicians by Lev Grossman. And I read it. And indeed, there was magic, as you would guess from a book title called The Magicians. But the characters, they were cynical. They were self-centered. And worst of all, they were boring. They were so boring that I don't actually remember their names. Like, I can tell you details of The Lord of the Rings or the books of C.S. Friedman or Frank Herbert. I can quote chunks of I can't quote much. I'm really bad at that. But like Dune, the Frank Herbert book, the Spice Must Flow, like I can quote chunks of that because they're interesting and they tell great stories of people who are good and living out these virtues, and they're trying to grapple with a broken world around them. And they struck me, and they've stuck with me for decades now. And then I read one of the more recent books, The Magicians, and it didn't. I got to the end of the book, and the book didn't end as in like it came to like a moral conclusion. Not that every book has to come to like a tidy, wrapped up, clean thing, but like it didn't come to a conclusion. It didn't end. It just kind of stopped. And I remember thinking, like, I knew this was a series. I don't have time to wait on the next book in the series. I tend to read series that are complete at this point, or watch TV shows that have a whole season out. I remember thinking, like, do I have any interest in reading the next book? And the answer was no, because the first book had been so cynical. Like, it didn't, like, there was no motion, there was no moral direction to it. It was just some cynical people being cynical with each other. And I've noticed this happening more often in fiction as of late. I read the first book in the Game of Thrones series. Game of Thrones became this TV series. It was one of the most popular TV series of the last couple years. And back before it was a TV series, I read the first book. And I read the first book thinking, I'm looking for something new to read. And it was kind of the same thing. The characters came off as being very self-serving. And the one character, like in the first book, there's this one character, this guy who's a king of a small nation who's defending the North because winter is coming. That's the tagline of the series. Winter is coming, and winter is coming from the North. And the king up in the North, he is defending all of the rest of civilization, and you're rooting for this king. And at the end of the first book, they kill him. He's dead. And it's like, I looked around at the rest of the characters involved in the end of this book, and I thought, I'm not interested in them. Like, they're all kind of self-centered, and they have their moments. They're interesting, but like, I don't want to read a bunch of people bickering with each other for the next 5 books. And that's what's fascinating about Game of Thrones. Like, this is my take on it. I talked to a former film critic from St. Louis about this to see if it was accurate. This is why I guessed about Game of Thrones, is that because the assumptions built into it are like cynical. The author, J.R.R. Martin, or George Martin, he's written 5 books, and he hasn't written the last books yet. And I suggested he's written himself in the corner because he doesn't have any sort of moral arc. He doesn't have an end. He's not going anywhere interesting. He's got just some people fighting with each other, and he doesn't know where he's going. And so they built a whole TV series based on a book series that wasn't finished, and then hoping that, I guess, that the author would write the last book before they got to the end of the TV series, and he didn't. And so they had to kind of like make up an ending, and it didn't go over well. I'm not saying that all new TV shows, all new books, all new movies are bad. Like, this is not Andy saying, go back to the good old days back when, that's not what I'm trying to get at. What I'm trying to say is that I'm seeing a creeping cynicism, a growing sense of despair, and a resultant apathy in the way that we tell stories as a culture. It is a problem that I first saw in books and the way that we write stories, the way that we tell stories of fantasy and fiction, but I see it in other places as well. And it comes to mind as I'm thinking about Easter, because this is the Easter season. And so what we're looking at today and for the next couple weeks is, what difference does resurrection make? Like, what difference does resurrection make? We've celebrated the resurrection this last Sunday. Well, so what? What does that matter for how we live day to day? And what I believe is one of the first difference and one of the biggest differences is that as people of the resurrection, we know that the most important story ever told, the most true, the most real, the most beautiful story ever told is the story of Jesus, of his life, death, and resurrection. And that this story does not ignore evil. You have to go through Good Friday to get to Easter, right? We don't ignore evil. We don't gloss over problems. We go through them. Not overcoming evil with evil, but as in the story of Jesus, we see how Jesus overcomes evil with forgiveness and reconciliation. That as people of this story, the true, real, and good story of Jesus Christ, right? This is the most true understanding of both God and creation, that if you want to know who God is, you look at the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's what you do. Like, that's where we know the most about who God is. And if you want to know about the goodness of creation, you look at the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That as people who are rooted in this story, this truth of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that we are people of a ridiculous, extravagant, and stubborn hope. That we are a people who can see where hope occurs and name it as good, that we cultivate hope, that we look at hope, we focus on hope as how we tell our stories. Right? And so when we tell stories, and we can see, like, we can recognize in stories, when the story of the Lord of the Rings, Frodo makes a sacrifice even in the face of overwhelming odds, and we respect it because he is sacrificing for the good. And that type of sacrifice, I mean, we have a phrase for it, carrying your cross, a sacrifice for the good, is worthy of respect. And is Frodo historical? Like, was Frodo a person who was born? No, but the story of Frodo is true. It's getting at something profound. It's getting at something that's real, that we who follow Jesus, we can be inspired by and honor what we see in Frodo, because there are moments in which Frodo is Christ-like, right? And this happens in so many other places. We can do this all over the place. It's Spiderman, the catchphrase that comes up with Spiderman in both comics and in movies. With great power comes great responsibility. That sounds familiar, right? The way that Jesus puts it in his parable of the talents is, from everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded, right? It's another way of saying, with great power comes great responsibility. Like, we can go around finding these stories, these echoes of the life, death, and resurrection in media all over the place. You can go to Les Miserables and you can find a story of redemption that is powerful, the way that a fallen man becomes a servant of people. It's just powerful, the way that happens. The way that difference is seen as a gift, that watch Star Trek The Next Generation. You're going to find that. The prime directive and the way that they interact with people. If you want to look at the power of sacrifice, go play the Mass Effect video game series on Xbox. I'll loan you my copy. And and you're in for a great ride, right? Hope and its fulfillment. You look at the original Star Wars trilogy and the way that the hope that someone can be redeemed and Luke not falling into the trap that his father had fallen into in the redemption of Darth Vader. Like, you can see, we could do this for a while. You can go through these movies and these TV series and books and comics, and you can see echoes of the truth that we find in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And I think it is important to hold on to stories that do that, to tell good stories, to tell stories that are profoundly true, and I think that's important because it's part of taming the cynicism that can come so easily today. Because there is a cynicism that leads to an apathy that is just, it's real. And it's floating. It's out there. And it's like this cynicism, if you turn on the news, you hear it. If you listen, if they win the next election, whether it's a national election or a local election, if they, whoever they is, win the election, the sense of oh, it's all going to be over, right? If this plan doesn't work out, it'll never work out. If this family member keeps on acting like they always do, it'll never get better. If the church doesn't do this, the problem will never get solved. There's a cynicism and a despair that leads to apathy that is a very real temptation. And my friends, I just got to tell you, the most basic difference that the resurrection makes is that it leads us to become people of hope. That following Jesus, we know the end of the story is good. And so we can cultivate our taste for the stories full of hope, stories full of people that dare to name what is wrong and then do something about it. Not giving in to despair, but following the example of Jesus, who did not turn and run away from Jerusalem, but got on a donkey and rode towards Jerusalem. He rode towards the problem and engaged it, and because he had a sense of hope, right, that we can have as well. And I must admit, this is where amazing and hopeful stories help me. Because if you say, Andy, just be like Jesus. Well, that's easy. Just be like Jesus. That can be intimidating and overwhelming. But if instead I look to the stories that have echoed something of Christ, I look at Sam in The Lord of the Rings and the way that he serves, and he just keeps on putting one foot in front of another. I look at Sam, I look at Drizzt the dark elf in his stories, I look at Captain Picard, Horatio Hornblower, I look at all these people from the stories that I have cherished, and I can look at them and I can see people who are living real, truthful lives that are based on hope. And no, these aren't, they're not real people. I can't go shake their hands, any of them. But these are the stories of people who are, and these well-wrought stories that are hopeful. All right? And I can see what they did and say, I can do that. I can do that. And if none of these names mean anything to you, I've got some recommendations for you, right? But hopefully you have your own stories, the stories that you have found that inspire you. However those stories have been told, TV, movie, books, comics, whatever they are. The first difference that the resurrection makes is that we are people of hope. That Jesus got over being dead, and following him, so will we. And so the rest of the story of our lives is going to be learning how we get there. We know the end of the story. That is the gift of Easter. Amen.